Okay, I am recording finally. Right, so let's jump into After Effects. Right, so let's start with the very basics of After Effects. First things you need to do is how to work with creating a composition, working on keyframes, and the positioning on the timeline, and the basic controls for pretty much every layer, which position, scale, rotation, opacity, and anchor point. So this is what we're going to cover on this first part. So just make sure we're working on the same space. Can you please go to Window, Workspace, Default, so you'll be able to see things on the screen on the same place where my stuff is, okay? Now, on this side here, this is your project screen. This is where you will find all the assets and files and everything that you import into After Effects. On this side, you have your menus, okay, for alignment, preview, effects and presets, and so on. Down here is a timeline where you will visualize pretty much all of the assets that you pile together in your composition. And over here, once we have a composition on, it's our visualizer. There's a preview window. This is where we see the magic working, magic happening. So let's all go into in your composition, and let's all select the preset HDTV 1080-24. That stands for High Definition Television, 1080 pixels wide, top, and 24 frames per second. Our default HD resolution will be 1920 by 1080, okay? And our aspect ratio will be locked at 16:9, right? And our frame rate will be standard 24. So what the frame rate means, you have a time code down here, which is a sequence of zeros. The first zero means how many hours, then how many minutes, how many seconds, and then how many frames. So what it means is at 24 frames, every time this last pair of zeros reaches 24, we add a second, okay? So if I want my composition to be like 6 seconds and a half, I would have to be like 6:12 at the end. But I'm making a composition that is only 8 seconds long for the sake of this tutorial, okay? You need to keep the same resolution and frame rate mostly all times to make sure that your compositions are consistent, right? And then I'm going to call this comp1, that's fine. Let's hit okay. Cool, so now here we have an empty composition. And let's start with something simple. Let's go to Layer, New, Solid, okay? Or shortcut Command Y on Mac, Control Y on PC. Right, let's make our solid red. You can just click on the color down here and change it to red manually. And then it's going to become a red solid. Then you click OK. So solids are, well, a solid color that will act as a layer, as an object that allows us to resize it, for example. You can just click on the corner right here to resize it. And then a solid will also work with the 5 basic controls that After Effects has for pretty much any object. Down here, you see your layer, first of all, right? This is your timeline that goes from 0 to 723, that's just wrong. 8 seconds. Should be able to go all the way to 8 seconds, never mind. Right. And you can see that my timeline is even broken down in half. So the 0012F, that means half a second, 12 frames. This red strip down here, it represents my solid. It starts at absolute 0, which is when the first frame of your timeline, and then it ends at the very last one, okay? Now, if I want this solid to only last for 4 seconds, I can just go to the end of the strip, grab it, and move to shrink it. So when my time indicator, which is this blue arrow, goes over the 4 seconds, it's not going to read this anymore because it ends right here. Bam, gone, right? Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to animate the solid that is now a square. So what you need is this little arrow down here. If you click in there and you drop down this and then drop down the transform, you will find the main controls, the main controls for pretty much anything that is an After Effects on object. So we'll leave the anchor point to last and then start with position. So you have 2 numbers here in your position parameter. So 1 represents your X coordinate, The other one represents your y coordinates. So that is horizontal and vertical, right? If I click and drag my solid, the numbers will go crazy, representing the position where that solid is at that moment in time. Scale, that is my size, right? If this chain link here is on, my proportions will be constrained and I'll be able to move and scale my object in a way that it does not distort my proportions. If I turn this off, it will allow me to mask each dimension separately. But let's leave it on. Next one is my rotation. For my rotation, I have two values. The first one being full revolutions. Okay, if I just do this, it doesn't mean much, it doesn't show you much, but it will make sense further on. And the other one is the degrees. So if I turn this one, I'm rotating my solid. Okay, let's rotate it 90 degrees. There you go. Cool. Last one is opacity, same thing as Photoshop, is basically the transparency. That's easy as. Now that I talked about these, I can talk about the anchor point. So this in the center of my solid is my anchor point, this tiny crosshair here. And it basically dictates the reference point to which all my transformations occur in After Effects. So again, if I rotate my solid like this, you see that it's actually using that anchor point as a point of reference to rotate. If I change my anchor point to this corner and I rotate my object, now it's going to rotate from that anchor point. I can even move it like outside my object and make it rotate on that point of reference still, right? Notice that if you try and grab your anchor point, you end up moving your object. So what you have to do is pick this tool right here, the pen behind, okay? Shortcut Y. And with that, you can actually move your anchor point around, okay? Ideally, you should keep your anchor point at the center of your objects as a general rule, unless you move it around for other specific purposes. Now, let's do some animation. Let's grab the solid and just move it to the side of the screen, like so. And you gotta make sure that you must put your time indicator on the position where you want your animation to start. So if I want my animation to start at 1 second, I will move my time indicator to 1 second. You can manually just drag it to 1 second and hold shift to make sure it snaps. Or you can just click in here in your time code and type in straight 1 second. Cool. Now, I'm going to move it to the position where I want it to begin, which is on the left side of the screen. Then I'm going to turn on my stopwatch for position. This little circle next to my control is called a stopwatch. So if I just click in there, it will turn blue, and then a keyframe will come up down on your timeline. So this tiny diamond shape thing here that is gray, but when you click it turns blue, because that means it's selected, that is a keyframe. And this keyframe tells me that at this point in time, these are the coordinates for my position. At 1 second, my position is this one here, 27.8 on one side and 540 on the other side. Now, I'll go forward in time to, let's say, 5 seconds, and I'm going to move my object to the other side of the screen by holding shift to make sure it moves on a straight line. Notice that when I move to a different point in time and I change any value from my object, a new keyframe is automatically generated. I'm just basically telling After Effects, cool, on point A, my object is in here. On point B, my object is in here. So when I play, I can actually see my object traveling across the screen from point A to point B. Now, a couple of things on that. It's taking 4 seconds to travel because it goes from 1 to 5. And that is quite slow, as you can see. You can't directly control speed of how objects travel in After Effects. So if you want to reduce, to increase the speed, you need to reduce either the time and the distance that your object travels. So if I make my animation last for 4 seconds for 1 second instead of 4, and then I play, it will actually go much faster because now it only takes 1 second to happen instead of 4 seconds. Also, when you create a path like this, it comes with Bezier handles that you can pull and adjust to change your trajectory. Something to be used like further on. For now, let's just stick with this movement, okay? Cool. So this is our object traveling from left to right on the screen. Ta-da, easy as. All we've done is move in time here, and with the time indicator, to where we want animation to begin. We turn on our stopwatch, we go forward in time, and then we change the value of that coordinate, in our case, the position. And then a new keyframe is automatically generated, and that is what creates this movement. The space between those two keyframes are actually generated automatically by After Effects. Over here, you can see there's plenty of dots in this line. Each dot represents a frame. So every time I navigate frame by frame, for example, 1, 2, 3, you can see that my anchor point will always stick to those frames. And they are all equally distant from each other. That means my speed will be constant from beginning to end. And that is bad, because in real life, objects have mass, air has resistance, and so on. So on that note, we need to actually emulate that feeling on our object as well, which takes us to a principle of animation known as slow in and slow out. So within this first keyframe, we can just click to select, and then right click. Bloody magic mouse, just give me a second, guys. Now click on the keyframe, right click, keyframe assistant, easy out on the first one, and easy in on the second one. Okay, you need to have those two arrows pointing opposite to each other. First one is out because it's moving out of this position and then into another position. Now when you play, you can see there is some acceleration on our movement, and it is acceleration at the end. So it accelerates in the beginning and then brakes at the end, thus creating this idea of realistic movement. And this is what animation is about, trying to replicate realistic movement. If we put these keyframes closer together, it's just a bullet, just real fast. And you can still see the acceleration in this acceleration, right? Notice how many keyframes that we have here. If we actually get this keyframe closer together, it's now very empty compared to what we had before. We only have now 24 dots on our line because our movement is taking 1 second, thus 24 frames. Yeah. Cool. So you can actually combine multiple animation parameters. So let's say at 3 seconds, I want my rotation to be different. So I'm turning on my rotation here at 3 seconds, and then I'll go to 5 seconds and make my rotation 1x. Okay, that means 1 complete revolution. So now my square will just rotate completely once. 1 complete revolution means a 360 degrees turn. Okay, look at me. This is a revolution. It's 1 complete 360 turn. Okay, and that's what the first number represents. The second one is just the rotation angle. Okay, the first one is a complete number of revolutions. So that means from my first keyframe at 3 seconds to my last keyframe at 5 seconds, my object will turn 1 full revolution. Okay. You can also change the scale, so I can turn my scale on here and go 4 to 5 seconds, and I can make my scale slightly bigger. So now it should rotate and grow at the same time. And you can actually go into the same thing with the keyframes to try and emulate a more realistic movement. That looks way better. It's more satisfying. Something that you need to keep in mind, though, is that if you have your time indicator position everywhere in the timeline that with your anchor points on, if you change anything, any value, a new keyframe will be generated automatically. And then what happens is from this point to this point where you create a new one, you might get this like reversing, for example, in my case, because I move it back. You're just adding more information to the timeline as you go by accident, and you truly don't want that. So please pay attention and bear in mind where and when you are actually putting together the keyframes on the timeline. Cool. Now, have in mind as well that if you turn off your anchor points, you are deleting all the keyframes that you had. So if you turn them off, you get rid of all the keyframes. Sweet. That concludes our first tutorial. Right, let's do our next tutorial. This one is called Breaking News. If you want to do what I did and just change the settings of your composition on the fly, you have to press Command K on a Mac, Control K on PC. Or you can just go to Composition and then Composition Settings. Cool? Cool. So let's go and grab the text tool, which is this one right here, horizontal type. Grab it, drag a box, and let's type in breaking news. I'm going to select my text, make that impact, and make that real big. You can just click and drag the number here on your character panel. Okay, by the way, when you create a text, your character panel should open up automatically. And you should have a text layer down here on your timeline that takes that comprises the entire duration of a timeline, and it will have its title be the same as whatever you write. On that note, let's select the news part and just make it extra big, like so. Then we can select both words, go down to our to our heading, and just organize it like so. Yes, and paragraph tab, center it. Slightly bigger, slightly bigger. There we go. Beautiful. Okay. Breaking news. If you are afraid that your thing is not centered or your anchor point is not centered, you can press Y to grab your anchor point and move it to the center. You don't have to be 100% at the center. You can just eyeball it. That's fine. Remember to press V to go back to your move/selection tool. If you are unsure that your thing is actually fully centralized, you can click on the align menu over here and then align horizontally and vertically. This will make sure that your thing is at the exact very center of your composition. Also notice that when I zoomed in, it looked very pixelated. Yeah. Depending on how you are viewing your stuff, your preview quality might change over here. Keeping it half at all times is actually good. It won't lower the quality of your preview, which will not ever by any chance lower the quality of a final render. Please have that in mind. But it will just make the software run faster. Now, for breaking news, we are going to work with only two controls, those being scale and rotation. On your keyboard, you can just click on a layer and select what channels you want to work, what parameters you want to work with. A is for anchor point, S is for scale, T is for opacity, because opacity is also transparency, P for position, S for scale, and R for rotation, right? I can just like click here to drop down the entire thing. Cool. So the first thing we're going to do is mess up with the scale. So our scale is at 100% here for the text. Please make sure that when you're changing the size of text, you're not working on your character panel. Don't change the size here. Put the size to what you want it to be, and then we're going to work with scale from here on. So I'm going to go to 1 second and turn on my scale and make my scale 0%. Because further on in time, I will make my scale 100% one more time. So it starts at 0 and grows to 100. It's basically growing from nothing to the center of the screen. And that's what we need. Then I'm also going to get some rotation going on. So I'm going to turn on my rotation control, forward in time, and then I'll make it 3 revolutions. Okay. So not only it will grow from nothing, it will also spin 3 times. Bam, breaking news. Actually, 3 and a little bit, like 15 degrees. That's fine. That looks better. More aesthetic. Now, because we could totally stop here, but we can actually take it further in very simple manner. First thing is to turn on some motion blur. This button right here, it turns motion blur for the entire composition. You click in that, have it highlighted, it will turn it on for the entire composition. But still, that is not enough. You need to turn it on individually for each layer. So in fact, we only have one layer, and here, this button is how you turn it on. If you're not seeing these options here, you can click down here to toggle switches and modes and swap between blending modes, track mattes, and your other configurations. Okay, so it's this button right here, toggle switches and modes. Make sure you have this one on, and this motion blur. There is a box underneath that you can just click. You can just tick the box to turn on motion blur for that layer. Now when I play, my fast movement will create some motion blur. There you go. Beautiful. It already enhances the quality of your animation and also makes it feel more believable. So now what I'm doing is I'm selecting this part here. I'm selecting those two keyframes, right click, keyframe assistant, easy out on the first one, and then easy in on the second one. Just adding to my realistic movement effect. Nice. Cool. Again, we could stop here, but we can take it further. If I select those two keyframes at the end, and I click here to open my graph editor, this might be a little bit confusing. Let's work with rotation so far. You can see that our graph curve is actually slightly curved, right? That is because when you click on it, you can actually see some Bezier handles that are controlling the speed pretty much of our rotation. If I am to accentuate these curves and in this graph even further, that actually looks slightly better. And depending on how we make the graph, it will change. Different graphs will give you different results. That looks cool as well. 15 degrees. That looks cool. It doesn't have the same impact. Still looks cool. There you go. Right? And then to make sure that our animation finishes, let's say at 4 seconds, after we're done with this animation, we can just grab our comp area, which is this one. You have those two gray bars on top of your timeline. The thin one at the top is your zoom. You can shrink that to zoom in your timeline. The other one is your work area. You can just shrink this, let's say to here. So when you play, it will loop from that point in time. It will loop from that section and not all the way to the end of the timeline. See, you can just press spacebar to loop to play. And also, if you want your composition to actually last for that time only, you can go Command-Shift-X, or you can go to Composition and then Trim Comp to Work Area, Command-Shift-X. This will make sure that your composition is now the same size as the work area that you trimmed over here. Okay. Right, and the last thing we're going to see about this breaking news thing is how we export that. So you're done with your animation and everything, and you need to submit your assignment or send it to a client. If you send your save file for After Effects, you will fail or get fired depending on the situation. You need to actually export your animation to a video file, and that's the next thing we're going to do. Let's all go to File, Export, and Add to Render Queue. File, Export, Add to Render Queue. Now, this will open your render queue down here. Okay, you can click on tabs to go back and forth, like so, right? And then your render queue will be here available. Everything that is in blue means that it has not yet been exported, and you can change the settings, and that's exactly what we're going to do. First of all, where it says output to, let's click on not yet specified. Notice that when I hover my mouse over the words, it actually gets highlighted. This is what we're looking for. I'll click in here and select the location where I want to save my stuff, which is desktop, and also the name of my file. Now, over here to output module, and this is very important, you click on the lossless word And then you need to change a few things on the format of your file. Keep it as QuickTime, and then on format options, you click in here and change from animation to Apple ProRes 422. Ideally, the best codec you could have at this stage is H.264, which unfortunately is not available on After Effects 2020 for Mac as off the shelf. We have to install a plugin to make it available. So in the sense of working with what we have, let's stick to Apple ProRes 422. Hit OK, hit OK, and then click on Render on this corner, and then you just wait. That blue bar is going across the screen, it's like a loading bar, and this is exporting my animation. Bam, done. Now when I go to my desktop, there it is. And it's only 9 megs large. Cool. So there you go.